The rain came down hard on the night Sarah Callahan lost everything she had left in the world. She stood under the small wooden awning of the Millers Creek train station, her thin coat soaked through, her 2 suitcases sitting in a puddle beside her feet. Inside those suitcases was all she owned. A few dresses. A photograph of her late husband. And the last $23 she had to her name. She was 28 years old, a widow for barely 6 months, and completely alone in a town she had never set foot in before. The letter in her coat pocket, now smudged and soggy from the rain, was the reason she had come all this way. A cousin she barely remembered had written to say there might be work for her here, a room she could rent, a fresh start far from the pain of the city she used to call home. But when she had knocked on the door of the address in that letter, an older woman had opened it just a crack and told her, with a face full of pity, that her cousin had passed away 2 winters ago. There was no room. There was no job. There was nothing waiting for her here at all. Sarah stood there now, watching the rain fall over the empty street, wondering how a person could feel so invisible in a world so full of people. If a story like this touches something in you, stay a moment longer, because this one is going to touch you even more before the night is through. And if you believe love can still find broken hearts in unexpected places, drop a comment and let me know you are here. She had nowhere to sleep. No family. No friends. And winter was closing in fast, the kind of cold that crept into a person's bones long before it touched their skin. It was in that moment, standing under a flickering lamp with her suitcases growing heavier by the second, that she saw a tall figure walking toward the station, leading a horse behind him. He wore a long weathered coat and a hat pulled low against the rain, and there was something steady in the way he moved, like a man who had faced storms far worse than this one and learned to walk through them without flinching. His name was Jacob Hale, and he had come to the station that night only to pick up a crate of supplies for his ranch. He wasn't looking for anyone. He wasn't expecting anyone. But when he saw the young woman standing alone in the rain, shivering, her eyes red from crying she was clearly trying to hide, something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in a very long time. Jacob had buried his own wife 3 years before, taken by a fever that no doctor in the county could stop. Since then, he had built a wall around his heart so high that most folks in town had stopped trying to climb it. He kept to himself. He worked his land from sunrise to sunset. He raised his 6-year-old daughter, Emily, the best way he knew how, though some nights he lay awake wondering if quiet suppers and long silences were really enough for a little girl who needed more warmth than he knew how to give. But something about the woman at the station made him stop walking. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice low and rough like gravel softened by rain, "you're going to catch your death standing out here." Sarah looked up at him, startled, wiping quickly at her eyes as though she could hide the tears that had already fallen. "I'm fine," she said, though her trembling voice betrayed her. "I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" She hesitated. And then, because there was something in his eyes that felt safe, something steady and unhurried, the truth slipped out before she could stop it. "I have nowhere left to go," she whispered. The words hung in the cold air between them, heavier than the rain itself. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. He thought of his empty house on the edge of town, the extra room that had sat untouched since his wife passed, the silence that filled every corner of that place except for Emily's small footsteps and quiet questions about her mother. "Funny," he said finally, a faint and unexpected softness breaking through his weathered face. "I have an empty house." Sarah blinked up at him, unsure if she had heard him right. "It's not much," Jacob continued, adjusting the collar of his coat. "But it's dry. And it's warm. And there's a room that's done nothing but collect dust for longer than I care to admit." "I couldn't," Sarah said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't even know you." "No," Jacob agreed. "You don't. But you also don't have anywhere else, and this rain isn't letting up any time soon." There was no charm in the way he spoke. No smooth words meant to win her over. Just plain honesty, the kind that somehow felt more comforting than any smooth-talking stranger ever could. Sarah looked down the empty street, at the darkness swallowing every direction she might have gone, and she realized she had a choice between the unknown safety of a stranger's home or the very real danger of a cold night with nowhere to hide from it. She picked up her suitcases. The ride to the ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't awkward so much as it was gentle, like two people who both understood there was no need to fill every silence with words. Sarah watched the fields pass by in the darkness, faint outlines of fences and barns illuminated only by the pale light of the moon breaking through the clouds. When they arrived, a small light flickered in the window of the farmhouse, and a young girl's voice called out the moment the door opened. "Papa." Emily came running, her nightgown swishing around her small legs, her curly brown hair bouncing with every step. She stopped short when she saw Sarah standing behind her father, her wide eyes studying the stranger with the kind of open curiosity only children seem to have. "Who's that?" Emily asked, tilting her head. "This is Miss Sarah," Jacob said gently, kneeling down to Emily's height. "She's going to stay with us for a little while." Emily considered this for a moment, then smiled, a small gap where one of her front teeth was missing. "Do you know any stories?" she asked Sarah directly, as if that was the only qualification that truly mattered. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, something warm breaking through the cold numbness she had carried since her husband's funeral. "I know a few," she said softly. "Good," Emily said, satisfied, and took Sarah's hand as though the matter was settled. That night, Sarah lay in the small guest room, staring up at the wooden ceiling beams, listening to the rain finally soften into a gentle patter against the roof. She thought of her husband, of the plans they had made together before illness took him from her too soon. She thought of how strange it was that a stranger's kindness could feel more like home in one evening than months of loneliness in the city ever had. The days that followed moved slowly, the way life does on a ranch, measured by sunrises and chores rather than clocks and schedules. Sarah began helping around the house without being asked, mending torn shirts, preparing meals, tending to the garden that had gone wild with neglect. Jacob never demanded any of it from her. He simply noticed, in his quiet way, the way the house began to feel less empty. In the evenings, Emily would climb into Sarah's lap by the fireplace and beg for a story, and Sarah found herself inventing tales of brave princesses and gentle dragons, weaving in little lessons about kindness and courage that made Emily's eyes light up with wonder. Jacob would sit across the room, pretending to mend a saddle or clean his rifle, but his eyes would drift toward them more often than he probably realized, watching the way his daughter laughed freely for the first time in longer than he could remember. Trust between Sarah and Jacob did not come through grand gestures or sweet words. It came through small moments. The way he made sure her boots were dry by the fire before she woke each morning. The way she left a plate warm for him when he came home late from mending fences in the cold. The way neither of them pushed the other to speak about their grief, but simply sat together in the quiet, letting the silence say what words could not. One evening, as autumn began turning the fields gold, Sarah found Jacob standing alone by the fence line, staring out at the horizon with a heaviness in his shoulders she hadn't seen before. "Everything all right?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Jacob was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "Bank sent a letter today," he said. "Says if I don't pay off the last of my father's debt by winter, they'll take the ranch." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She had come to love this land in her own quiet way, the fields, the barn, the little house that had slowly begun to feel like her own home too. "How much do you need?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. "More than I have. More than I can make selling cattle before the snow comes." Sarah thought of the small savings she had left, the $23 that had once felt like her only lifeline, and though it was nowhere near enough to solve the problem, she offered it anyway, because it was all she had to give. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "I can't take your money," he said gently. "But I thank you for offering it." "Then let me help another way," Sarah said. "I can take in mending work from town. I can sell preserves at the market. We'll find a way." Jacob's throat tightened at the word "we." It had been so long since anyone had stood beside him in his troubles instead of simply watching him carry them alone. The following weeks brought harder trials than either of them expected. A fire broke out in the barn one night, sparked by a lantern knocked over during a sudden storm, and Sarah ran through the smoke without hesitation to help Jacob free the terrified horses before the flames could spread further. They worked side by side through the chaos, choking on smoke, hearts pounding, until the fire was finally beaten back and the barn, though damaged, still stood. Exhausted and soot-streaked, they sat together on the porch steps afterward, the adrenaline slowly fading into something quieter. "You didn't have to do that," Jacob said, glancing at her. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied simply. "This is my home too now." The word surprised them both, hanging in the night air with a truth neither had spoken aloud until that moment. Not long after, sickness swept through Emily, a fever that climbed higher each night despite every remedy Sarah tried. Jacob rode through a storm to fetch the town doctor, fear gripping his chest tighter than it ever had, even during the darkest days after his wife's passing. Sarah sat beside Emily's bed the entire night, pressing cool cloths to her small forehead, whispering the same gentle stories that had once made her laugh, praying with everything she had that the little girl who had already stolen her heart would be all right. When the fever finally broke just before dawn, Jacob found Sarah asleep in the chair beside Emily's bed, her hand still resting protectively over his daughter's smaller one. Something in his chest broke open in that moment, a wall he had built for 3 long years finally crumbling under the weight of what he saw before him. Not just a woman who had nowhere else to go, but a woman who had, without either of them fully realizing it, become exactly where he wanted to be. Word soon spread through town about the widow now living at the Hale Ranch, and not everyone received the news kindly. Jacob's aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Constance who had never approved of anyone she considered beneath her family's name, arrived unannounced one afternoon with cutting words about strangers taking advantage of grieving men and children needing a proper mother, not some homeless drifter passing through. Sarah stood quietly through the harsh words, her hands trembling at her sides, old wounds of rejection and unworthiness rising up painfully inside her chest. But before she could excuse herself, Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady and firm in a way the whole town would later talk about for weeks. "She is not a burden in this house," he said, looking his aunt directly in the eye. "She is the reason this house finally feels like a home again. And if you cannot speak to her with respect, you are welcome to leave the way you came." Constance left in a huff of offended pride, but Sarah stood frozen in place, tears welling in her eyes, not from hurt this time, but from the overwhelming warmth of being defended, of being chosen, of finally being seen as worth fighting for. That evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Jacob found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, staring quietly at the stars scattered across the dark sky. "I'm sorry about my aunt," he said, sitting down beside her. "Don't be," Sarah said softly. "I've heard worse. I've felt worse. I think what surprised me most wasn't what she said. It was what you said back." Jacob was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I meant every word," he said finally. "This house was empty for so long, Sarah. Not just quiet. Empty. And then you walked into it, and somehow, without even trying, you filled up every corner that had been hollow since Anna passed." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "I wasn't looking for this," Jacob continued, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I wasn't looking for anyone. But I look at you, and I see someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still choose to be gentle with the world anyway. I see someone Emily loves like she's known you her whole life. And I see someone I don't want to imagine my life without anymore." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the kind that came not from pain but from a happiness she had almost forgotten how to recognize. "I came here with nothing," she whispered. "I had nowhere left to go. And somehow, this empty house became the fullest place I've ever known." Jacob reached over, gently taking her hand in his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could. "Stay," he said simply. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. but because this is where you belong. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion rising in her throat, and leaned into him as the stars stretched endlessly above the quiet ranch that had somehow, against all odds, become her home. They were married the following spring, a small and simple ceremony held right there on the ranch, surrounded by fields turning green again after the long winter. Emily insisted on scattering wildflowers along the aisle, her small face beaming with a joy that lit up the entire gathering. As Sarah stood before Jacob, exchanging vows beneath the wide open sky, Emily tugged gently at her dress, looking up with wide, hopeful eyes. "Can I call you Mommy now?" she whispered. Sarah knelt down immediately, tears streaming freely down her face as she pulled the little girl into her arms. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered back. "You most certainly can." The ranch that had once stood silent and grieving now echoed with laughter, with the sound of small feet running across wooden floors, with the warmth of a family rebuilt from the broken pieces of two hearts that had once believed love was no longer possible for them. Sarah often thought back to that rainy night at the train station, to the moment she had whispered those hopeless words into the cold darkness. She had nowhere left to go. And somehow, in the most unexpected way, an empty house and a quiet, wounded cowboy had given her something she thought she had lost forever. A home. A family. A love she never stopped believing in, even when the world had given her every reason to. If this story warmed your heart tonight, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and share what part of Sarah and Jacob's journey touched you the most. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you, stories of broken hearts finding their way home, of love arriving exactly when it's needed most. Until next time, may you always find your way to the place where you belong.